What's up guys, my name is Ace, and Season 2 Reloaded came with a pretty solid list of weapon balancing, so in today's video we're going to be breaking this down in great detail. And let's just dive right into this one and talk about the first thing they mentioned here for global gameplay changes. And with this, they mention upon aiming down sight, the crosshair will now transition directly to the center of the player's screen rather than easing into position. And this change seems to be extremely subtle. It's very hard to pick up on. I don't think this is really that big of a deal. It's not like the previous changes they made to the centering and idle sway. But with this, if you pay really close attention pre-patch versus post-patch, on the post-patch side, it does appear that our reticle after aiming down sight will center into our initial point of aim a little bit quicker and in a slightly more direct route than on the left-hand side. Now again, this is super subtle. You might not even really be able to tell the difference even when I slow it down and zoom in super far. But I believe that's all that really changed here. And I do want to point out this doesn't apply to sniper rifles. Those will still not aim down sight to the direct center of your screen. And that is intentional for balancing purposes to ensure that quickscoping doesn't become way too powerful. So that's the first general change out of the way. Now let's get into the specific weapons, and we're going to start it off with assault rifles, and the BP50 saw some nerfs, as expected. This gun launched way too powerful. And the first thing that changed here is they nerfed our hipfire as well as our tac stance values. So it no longer has the best hipfire values in the assault rifle category. It's much more in line with the other assault rifles. And honestly, it's still pretty decent at hipfiring, and even in tac stance, it's still very solid. One quick note on this as well, is you might notice my pre-patch values don't line up with what the patch notes say. And this is because it appears there was actually a hidden nerf to the hipfire at some point between the launch of Season 2 and Season 2 Reloaded, and I don't recall seeing that mentioned anywhere in any patch notes. So what I'm showing here are the values that were present when the BP50 launched and when I made my gun guide on that BP50. But that's not the only thing they changed. They also nerfed our aim down sight speed a little bit. It went from 220 milliseconds by default to 230 milliseconds. This is now tied for being the fastest in the assault rifle category. And with our aim walking speed, pre-patch, it was ridiculous for an assault rifle at 3.4 meters per second. That has been cut down to 3.0 meters per second, which is still faster than all of the other assault rifles in the game. To stop that off, we saw a recoil nerf, and while they stated they increased the horizontal recoil by 48%, which seems like a massive increase to recoil, when you look at it side by side, I'm not seeing any notable change to the horizontal recoil on this, and our vertical recoil is slightly improved, which they also mentioned in the patch notes. There was a 5% improvement to vertical recoil. And as a result, looking at it side by side here, I actually prefer the post-patch recoil on the BP50. So I don't know if this was a bug and that horizontal recoil nerf just didn't apply or something, but as it is right now, at least, I actually consider this to be a slight buff to the recoil on the BP50. And that's it for the base BP50. And while there were quite a few little nerfs here to this gun, it was mainly just to bring it in line with the best version of the other assault rifles in the game. So these nerfs took this from being like by far the best assault rifle in a bunch of categories to now just being the best by a small margin in those categories. So the BP50 is still an amazing gun. I definitely still consider this to be a top tier weapon in this game. But diving in a little deeper, there were also a couple attachment adjustments on the BP50 specifically. The first one was to the forebearer heavy stock, and they mentioned here they increased the recoil gun kit benefit from 11% to 16%. So this is a buff. And when we look at pre-patch versus post-patch, you can see it's a little bit tighter together in that post-patch recoil pattern. And then finally for the BP50, with the MWIII 40 stock, they decreased our aim down sight time benefit from 7% down to 2%. So that's just a little bit of a nerf to that particular stock. As for the next assault rifle they adjusted, this is the SVA 545. It actually saw a couple buffs. Our aim down sight speed went from 250 milliseconds down to 230 milliseconds, which is nice to see. And our sprint out time was also very noticeably improved. It went from 210 milliseconds down to 189 milliseconds. So that should just make this gun a little bit better at being more aggressive. Then let's get into the battle rifle category, and we saw a few nerfs to the BAS-B. And the first thing we see is a very slight adjustment to our damage values in the first two damage ranges. They just slightly nerfed these values. And at the end of the day, this still has a 4-shot kill potential in the first two damage ranges, just like pre-patch. However, in that second damage range, now we have to hit every one of our 4 shots to the torso and arms if we want to maintain a 4-shot kill. Whereas pre-patch, it was a bit more forgiving. We could mix one leg shot in there, and that would still be fine. As for how this impacts the maximum damage range though, it doesn't. This was a guaranteed 4-shot kill pre-patch, and it's a guaranteed 4-shot kill post-patch to the body. So honestly, a super slight nerf here to the BAS-B when it comes to damages, but they also nerfed our range values a little bit. And as we can see here, our first 2 damage ranges have been reduced by a noticeable margin, so that guaranteed 4-shot kill range is now just over 30 meters, whereas it used to be over 35 meters. And that's it when it comes to the BAS-B. Overall, this is still a very solid gun, still one of the best guns in the game. It's just going to be slightly worse beyond 30 meters now. Next, let's talk about the Sidewinder. This one saw a few buffs. The first thing they mentioned here is they decreased the recoil intensity during sustained fire slightly. And when we look at pre-patch versus post-patch, we're mainly looking toward the end of the recoil plot, like the top half of the recoil plot. In that case, it does appear there's a little less horizontal recoil there. It doesn't zigzag quite as harshly post-patch compared to pre-patch. But as they said in the patch notes, this is a slight adjustment. And more often than not, you should have your kill before you get into that second half of the magazine anyway. Next, with the A90 Venom stock specifically, they decreased the recoil gun kick penalty from 16% to 5%. So this is a buff to this stock. It's not going to harm our recoil as much. And when we look at it side by side, you can see post-patch we have a tighter general grouping with our shots. And then finally for the Sidewinder, the RB Rapid Strike Grip saw a couple buffs. The first thing is our aim down sight time when just using this attachment went from 241 milliseconds down to 235 milliseconds, so a very slight buff there. And then on top of this, they decreased the recoil control penalty from 10% to 4%. And with that, you can definitely see the total magnitude of recoil was cut down quite considerably when using this attachment. Now finally, for the battle rifle category, the NTZ-762 with the Jack Heretic carbine kit specifically, this one saw a little bit of a recoil buff here. As we can see, pre-patch it was really inconsistent, and I noticed this many times in my testing. One recoil pattern would have a lot more recoil than the other recoil pattern for some reason. Now, after this update, there's a lot more consistency with the recoil I find, and it doesn't drift to the left as much as it did pre-patch. Now, it is still going to zigzag on you a fair amount, so it's not suddenly like a super accurate low recoil gun, but you should definitely notice it's got less recoil now, and it is a bit more consistent overall. And that wraps it up for the battle rifle category. Next, let's get into SMGs. And with the RAM-9, they buffed the Speedway V5 short barrel. And the first thing they did here is they gave a slight improvement to our aim down sight speed when using this barrel from 230 milliseconds down to 220 milliseconds. And then on top of that, they very slightly improved our recoil benefits when using this barrel. And you can see the post-patch recoil has a slightly better recoil plot compared to pre-patch, but it's not a massive difference by any means. Then sticking to the RAM-9, the FSS Imperator Light Barrel, this one saw an increased damage range benefit from 12% up to 20%, and an increased bullet velocity benefit from 15% up to 20%. And then finally for the RAM-9 barrels, the Boreal 6C Suppressed Barrel saw a decreased bullet velocity penalty from 20% down to 12%, and a decreased damage range penalty from 20% down to 12%. So that's also a buff since they're reducing the penalties that we saw with that barrel. After that, let's move on to the AMR9 with the Jack Ettin kit, which has that double barrel. What they did with this is they've now made sure that the bullets will always stack in a vertical column for every shot that you fire, since you're firing 2 bullets at once. Pre-patch, there was just some randomness, so they would be randomly spread from each other within a certain range. Now, you're always going to see those 2 bullets vertically stacked every time you fire. And this actually makes a noticeable difference to our general recoil as well. When we're firing this in full auto, you can see here, pre-patch versus post-patch, there's going to be fewer gaps and just less randomness in general with your recoil. So this appears to be a fairly notable buff to the Ettin kit. As for the next SMG that was adjusted, this is the WSP9, and this one just saw some slight hipfire buffs as well as a tac stance spread buff. You can see all of those values have been reduced. After that, with the Rival 9 using the Jack Headhunter kit, we actually saw a pretty massive increase to our second damage range here from 30 meters all the way up to 45.7 meters. Now, at the end of the day, this is still a 5-shot kill to the body, but this is where it's going to be a very consistent 5-shot kill to the body. So you may notice some improvement here, and while this was a huge buff to the range value itself, I don't think this is really going to make the gun all that much more effective. Then getting into the Modern Warfare 2 SMGs, in the patch notes they mentioned they improved the alignment of the default iron sight optic on the PDSW, and I believe they just centered the front sight just a little bit better compared to the rear sights here, so you might notice a very slight improvement there. And then finally for SMGs, the Lachmann SUB saw some pretty drastic range improvements across the board. All of the range values were increased, and these were very noticeable improvements, which means this gun should be quite a bit better post-patch compared to pre-patch. Now, at the end of the day, I'm not entirely convinced that this makes the Lachmann SUB now like a top tier SMG, simply because its time to kill up close isn't really amazing for an SMG in this game at 300 milliseconds, but it should at least be a lot more versatile now since that 300 millisecond time to kill is going to be stretched out noticeably farther. And there we go, that wraps it up for all of the SMG changes. Now let's talk briefly about shotguns. What they did here is with the Lockwood 680, the barrels will no longer change your pellet count. Pre-patch, with this gun specifically, changing your barrel meant you could also change your pellet count, and your pellet count would always match your tube capacity with that given barrel, which meant with the Lockwood Defender Heavy Barrel, for instance, you had a 10 shell tube capacity, and therefore you fired 10 pellets rather than 6 with every shot that you fired. Now, I went in to do the testing on this to see if this had an impact on our damage range potential, and it turns out it doesn't. We have the exact same one-hit kill potential with all of the barrels, but since we're firing fewer pellets with that Lockwood Defender Heavy Barrel, perhaps if we're hip firing with a reasonably wide hip fire spread, we're going to hit fewer pellets, and therefore the odds of getting a one-shot kill may go down in some specific scenarios. In general, all of our potential values are still going to be the same, so I don't think we're actually going to notice a significant difference here to the Lockwood 680, but this is a change that's at least worth mentioning. And with that, we can now move into the LMG category, and the first thing here is with the Pulemyot 762, they increase the strength of our aim down sight idle sway. And when we look at pre-patch versus post-patch, you can see there's slightly more idle sway post-patch compared to pre-patch, but really I wouldn't call this a massive change by any means. Additionally, when using the Jack Annihilator Bullpup kit on this, they did nerf the bullet velocity here from 760 meters per second down to 660 meters per second, which is definitely a noticeable adjustment if we're talking about really long-range engagements. However, within the vast majority of gunfights you'll find on the 6v6 maps at least, you probably wouldn't even notice a difference here. Then let's talk about the Bruen Mk a little bit. This one saw a good handful of buffs. The first thing is our aim down sight time was reduced from 450 milliseconds down to 410 milliseconds, so that's quite a noticeable reduction to our aim down sight time, which is excellent. Also, our base movement speed was very noticeably improved. It used to be by far the worst in the LMG category at 3.9 meters per second. That's been bumped up to 4.4 meters per second, which is now pretty solid for an LMG at least. Also, our crouch movement speed improved, our tactical sprint movement speed improved slightly, and our aim walking movement speed improved very noticeably from 1.9 meters per second up to 2.4 meters per second, which is now much more in line with the other LMGs in the game. That's not it for this gun though. We also saw a buff to the body multipliers, and essentially all they did here is pre-patch our bonus damage zone to the body included the upper torso and the arms, whereas post-patch, it's now the full torso and the arms. So what this means in-game is in the maximum damage range, you won't notice any difference at all, simply because this gun is always a 5-shot kill anywhere in the body in that range. In saying that though, beyond 29.7 meters, now it's just going to be a bit more consistent with a 5-shot kill because you have to hit all 5 shots to that bonus zone in order to maintain a 5-shot kill, and that bonus zone is now larger, and therefore the odds of you getting a 5-shot kill have improved a bit here. Next up, let's move into the sniper rifle category, and with the KATT AMR, this one saw a buff to its aim down sight time. It went from 760 milliseconds down to 720 milliseconds, so a noticeable improvement, but this is still a very slow aim down sight speed for this game. Then with the SPX80, they increased our aim down sight time, so this was a nerf from 545 milliseconds up to 570 milliseconds. And that's it for the sniper category, so let's move into handguns now. And with the Core 45's conversion kit, that binary fire kit, they increased our bullet velocity from 525 meters per second up to 600 meters per second, which is nice to see. Then there results some visual issues with the Jack Ferocity carbine kit, but nothing actually changed as far as its performance goes. And then finally for handguns, with the 9mm Damon, they added the missing pistol fast draw benefit that wasn't there pre-patch. So that was mainly just a bug fix, so you can now use that fast draw mechanic. And with that, this just leaves us with one last adjustment they made here, and this is to the Jack Limb Ripper, which is that underbarrel chainsaw. They actually buffed this a little bit. The first thing they did is they increased our movement speed while revving the chainsaw by 25%, so you can get around the map a little bit faster and possibly even catch up to enemy players while doing that, whereas pre-patch, that was just not viable at all. They also increased our damage range from 1.1 meters up to 1.4 meters, and they increased the amount of damage that we deal per hit from 36 up to 50. Although based on my testing, it appears that it deals 2 of these damage ticks in 1 hit marker, because in my testing, I was noticing 72 damage per hit. But in either case, what this means is our time to kill potential when using the chainsaw in this manner, when you're actually revving up the chainsaw. Pre-patch, this was 200 milliseconds. Post-patch, this is now 100 milliseconds. In general, you're probably still better off using this as a regular melee weapon though, because it just simply kills faster. And there we go, that finally wraps it up for all of the weapon balancing that took place with the Season 2 Reloaded update. One thing I wanted to point out at the end of the video here is it seems like there's a handful of hidden changes and additions they made with this update as well, and I do plan on covering that in a separate video. I've also heard rumors of some hidden adjustments to weapons. I'm not 100% sure on that yet, but I will do some testing on that, and if there were any hidden changes, I'll be sure to keep you guys updated on that. And with that, this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How are you feeling about the weapon balancing that took place with this Season 2 Reloaded update? Are you generally happy with the changes you're seeing here, or not so much? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.